Well, hello everyone, and I want to welcome you back to another live edition of our WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And of course, I am your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. And before we get to tonight's guest, again, we've got two wonderful sponsors for our show that I want to give a shout out to: Quest Jewelers of Merrifield, Virginia. QuestJewelers.com. You contact Pete and Wantane, and they'll hook you up with whatever you're looking for. And for those of you folks out there that miss giving that special something to someone for Valentine's Day, give Pete or Juan a call, and they will definitely take care of you. So please take a look. Go to the website and see what they have for you. And if you don't see it there, they'll make it. I also want to thank our other great sponsor, Nationwide IT Services. NIS is a service-disabled veteran-owned small business located here in Fairfax, Virginia, and CK Park and his crew have a professional group of people working at the company. They are there to help you with all your business needs, whether you need training, IT support, 360-degree assessment, survey development, program management. He's got a professional group of employees there. And by the way, CK employs about 43% of his staff are veterans. So we want to appreciate, of course, his continued support for our show. So thank you to both of our sponsors. Now, I want to get to tonight's guest, and this is a little interesting. We have with us tonight Dr. Tina Garcia. Tina was born in Washington, D.C. and joined the Air Force back in the mid-'70s and graduated and went to basic training. And she started off going to the all-male Air Force Police Academy, which is kind of interesting of itself. We're going to let her tell us a little bit about that. She actually graduated from the police academy and was one of the first in her class to be a female to wear the combat parade. So it was kind of interesting that she seemed to break ground in a couple of areas in the Air Force. She was assigned to the Tactical Air Command headquarters and was honorably discharged in 1977, having worked for the Office of Special Investigations. So Tina has now moved on to her civilian life, and I don't want to give away everything because we've got some interesting things to talk about. But Tina, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show tonight.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. What an honor.
Yeah, it's always great to talk to the folks out there that are doing the kind of work that you're doing, and we're going to get into that here in a little while. But I just want to talk a little bit about your time in the Air Force. And I grew up, I'm a child of the 70s myself, and I remember we lived near Keesler Air Force Base down in Biloxi, Mississippi during my high school days when I was younger. And so I was around the Air Force. I actually had one of my parents was in the Air Force for a while, and so I'm kind of familiar, but it seems like you broke a lot of ground as a female enlistee in the Air Force. So how did you get in? What prompted you to join the Air Force in the first place?
Well, I grew up in Manassas, Virginia.
Okay.
And I graduated from Stonewall Jackson High School. And I admit that I was a nerd. There was no one in my family. I was the first to graduate from high school. So my father was 101st Airborne Division, and I was a tomboy. It was not only a way to go to college, but I just firmly believed in my father's commitment to service above self. I went into an all-female. I was in the Women Air Force. And during that time, I was sworn in 74. And of course, in 74, Ruth Bader Ginsburg won her first Supreme Court arguments, forcing the military to pay women equal pay for equal work.
Yeah.
So coincidentally, the Air Force decided to take the smallest female and put me into an all-male Air Force Police Academy. And little did they know that I enjoyed shooting guns, even though I'd never shot a gun in my life. And it was one of those things where I just didn't want to give up. I just felt so honored to be part of a team. That doesn't mean that my brothers at arms were happy to have me.
Yeah.
I was a scrappy little thing growing up in Manassas, Virginia. So it was not my intention to be what the Air Force now recognizes as the first female to wear that beret. But it was an honor to serve, and I'm happy I did it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you said a couple of things that kind of triggered with me. I actually spent 2.5 years in the 101st Airborne during my Army career. And you know, it's a little different than you, but you know, I spent most of my career in all male units because I went from artillery to the chemical corps, and I spent most of my time in combat arms units, including infantry and armored cav units. So I get to Germany, my last tour over there. I make E8. They want to make me a first sergeant. So they offer me the first sergeant position of a signal battalion. And it was the first unit I had been in my entire career with female soldiers.
Wow.
So yes, and that was an experience. So, you know, we're kind of on opposite sides here of the experience, but I you know, and I'm sure it was tougher for you because me being the first sergeant, you know, I was in charge and what I say goes. So, you know, I had that luxury. But it was interesting for me as well, you know, learning to deal with female soldiers when I had never been around them before. And I'm sure it was really challenging for you, you know, being in an all-male unit and being the first woman to walk in the door.
Well, Paul, thank you for saying that. It was a challenge. They didn't have ladies' bathrooms. A broom closet was outfitted for me, but I will say that my comfort and my ability to shoot at the range, I mean, for whatever reason, I could shoot the eyes out of a gnat. That is a way that to really earn the respect.
Yeah.
When I graduated at the top of my class as the first female, and I was told, of course, there was a lot of press there. I was told I was going to go to Camp Bullis. I thought it was like a church camp. And, you know, in Manassas, Virginia, you have a camp. You think, well, Camp Bullis, if anybody wants to Google that, is still one of the premier combat schools for all the services.
Yeah.
And as much fun as it was at the range, blowing stuff up with grenades and jumping out, I mean, I really, really enjoyed that. That was my Manassas growing up, playing ball in the streets. And
well, that made you fit right in then, didn't it?
And you know, I had to get over the anger though, Paul, because for the first year and a half, my military records still show me as a male. And that's not unusual. For the 10 years I've been a volunteer veterans advocates, many of the Air Force veterans records, military records even now show us as males. So, you know, we still have some progress to be made there.
Yeah.
But I love you talking about how you were on the other side of that.
Yeah.
I know we'll probably get into the whole veterans benefits and the importance of records and being able to show what you did in the military. Fortunately, those MOSs, you know, your military specialist designations. Fortunately, on my DD 214, it shows that I graduated from Camp Bullis and, you know, my combat police experience. And so what a story, right? I mean, we're old as dirt, Paul.
you you sound like my wife. I don't have a name any longer. She just calls me old man.
I,
So
I
yeah,
have special affinity. You know what? We served, but I have to tell you, we didn't serve for ourselves. We served
no,
for our families, didn't we? I mean, for me to want my father to be proud of me, to want my country to be proud of me. As a volunteer veterans advocate for the past 10 years, it means so much to me. The families that are taking our children, Paul, I don't know about you, but my poor children, when I got out of the military and had kids, we would go on forced marches in the woods, those, those kinds of things. So yeah, we're old, and what a story if we can make a difference in
well,
one
it's
life.
interesting you say that because I've had other veteran guests, of course, on the show over the last several years, and they all talk about how important it was for them to serve. And they all had different reasons, of course, why they served, but they all talked about how important they thought it was. And, you mentioned your father and, wanting him to be proud of you. And, I had the conversation with a number of my guests. I joined the military out of curiosity because my father was killed when I was 5 in an Army training accident. So I joined because I was curious. He was in, and I was curious as to what he saw in it. And so that's how I kind of followed in his footsteps. I didn't have a chance to make him proud, but he was a pretty strong influence as to why I joined. But you spent all that time serving, and I know you wrapped up your career in the Office of Special Investigation, which I'm sure was a pretty interesting assignment for
Do you know it was interesting in what we were doing. It in hindsight now, right after what I'm approaching a half a century ago.
you.
So right, my memories of that time, I
Yeah,
just remember, and of course, as a volunteer veterans advocate, I get to talk with other service members at my time, being told we couldn't share secrets. So many of the vets, so many, especially when I'm holding the hands of veterans in hospice,
yeah,
something that I do because believe me, I get far more out of it than I put into it. But we talk about the secrets, the stories that we can't share,
yeah,
because it's almost as if we're sharing trauma. And far more than I do, Paul, that especially in the Army, that mission was kill or be killed.
yeah,
It didn't matter if you were on the front lines, or humping, behind some enemy territory. It was about fear, and it was about stories that you don't necessarily want to share with
yeah,
others. You don't want to share that trauma. But what I admire so much about your story, Paul, I want to be like you when I grow up, is you are creating a sense of community where we can talk, and we can remember the importance of our family and how they're dealing with us, and if we can make a difference as you are to one other veteran's life, where we can share and know that service above self, we know what we will die for, our country, our community. But now at this advanced stage of my life, I want to know what we can live for.
yeah,
And we can live for each other. We can live for that strength of community and in our families. One of the biggest issues now that we're dealing with in the VA is the whole issue of suicide. And
oh yeah,
for
yeah,
some of the folks that have seen some of my television interviews, I talk about how my success with talking with veterans is just to say, okay, we know what we'll die for, but what will we live for? That service above self, that belief that, God is a lot better at being God than we will ever be. So let's just focus on what we can live for each other.
You know what? I was just going to say that's a very good point, because, you're talking about how we can share with one another. And I got to tell you, Tina, and, our studio director will tell you as well, that we've had, including my last guest, we've had a number of guests here on my show talking about some of their experiences. And I mean, just the tears, being able to talk about it, just release the feelings. And I'm not saying, that's the first time they've done it was here on my show, but they had the opportunity. We got in discussion, and there are times when the discussion really turned, into, for lack of a better word, a tear fest, as we talked about things. And, you're talking about wanting to live forward now, and, being able to get that help in the suicides. And we're going to talk about some of that here in the second half of the show. But, I've told a number of my guests in the discussion, my wife, I think, practically saved my life, because my PTSD didn't hit me until I was in my mid 50s, and it hit hard. It hit often, and I was really struggling. And she's the one who finally pushed me to go get help. And she said, I can't help you with this. You have to go get help. And, if it hadn't have been for her, I really don't know how I'd be feeling. So you're right. It's so important that we have that outlet with either fellow veterans or our families, that we can do this type of stuff and have these discussions. But before we talk a little more about what you're doing now, I just want to ask you an interesting question here. You went through law school, you got your Juris Doctorate, and, I guess my curiosity is, that's a lot of hard work. And yet you've now dedicated your life, instead of actually, being a regular practicing attorney in a law firm, to all of these veteran service and veterans programs. So I'm just kind of curious, how did you do that? What made you decide to do that?
Well, Paul, first of all, let me say that I so look forward to the day that I can meet your wife. That leads into, when I got out of the military, I knew I didn't want to be a cop. I didn't want to do combat. But I had this devotion to the oath that I swore to never leave a brother behind. So I went into real estate. I started a real estate company in Northern Virginia, surrounded by military bases. And I had the honor of helping Colin Powell buy a house in Dale City, Virginia. And I just remember one thing, that, first of all, Colin's devotion to his dear wife. But he took me aside one day and he said, Tina, post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It is a consequence of trauma. We're looking at houses, and there's a car backfired, and I scream, hit the ground, and then I start crawling towards this. So I went into serving veterans and had the honor of just being very, very, very successful. And then in the mid 90s, I won the White House Business of the Year award for my military affordable housing initiative. And
Yeah.
Paul, I have to say, it was just a very simple program, but that allowed me to get the scholarship to go to law school. I never wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to continue that service above self initiative. It's just been something that I've done, and it's been angels along the way. Colin Powell. I mean, I'm associated locally with our Jefferson County Veterans Group. Having been successful in real estate, and then still having that need to reach out to my brothers and sisters at arms, but more importantly, the families that support us. And it's just an honor to be able to do something that you feel God called you to do.
Yeah, it's you talk so enthusiastically about what you're doing, and that's incredible that you spent all that time in school, but now you're devoting your life to doing the things that you're doing. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back on the other side of the break, we're going to continue our discussion with Dr. Tina Garcia, and we're going to find out a little bit more about just what she is doing now. So we'll be right back after a quick message from our sponsors. All right, welcome back, everyone. And we've been having our conversation tonight with Dr. Tina Garcia, an Air Force veteran. And, I want to continue on now because it really impresses me, Tina, that, I know that you went to the University of Denver and got your degrees. And I believe you also worked for the Colorado Attorney General's office for a while, while in the midst of all this. But, now here you are, and I've really been touched by what you've been talking about in terms of your desire to give back and serve your fellow veterans, and I got to ask you, having spent some time in the Washington D.C. VA hospital, when I was going through some of my evaluations, I had to go down there to get my my disabled veteran ID card from the VA. I got to tell you, a big burly guy like me spending all that time in the Army, it hurt me to go in that hospital. To see some of the older Vietnam veterans in wheelchairs, and then seeing some of the younger veterans of Iraqi freedom and Afghanistan, and in there missing limbs, and in there with their families trying to get help from the VA. And I worked for the VA for a couple of years during my civilian career, that I'm getting ready to retire from later this year. And so I had to go out to the VA hospital occasionally because I supported the education center, the training center down there.
That's right.
And, to know that you spend a lot of your time working at the Denver VA hospital is just, it's got to be not only a rewarding experience, but it's got to be a gut-wrenching experience at times, I'm sure.
I think you said it very well, Paul. I mean, I'm going to give you an example of a couple of veterans that came back from Vietnam and had been denied just their VA basic medical care. Well, being a volunteer at the VA, I would take veterans in, put down their DD 214, and then just mention to the VA person that, okay, here's my background, here's what I can tell you. You either give this veteran their benefits or call the police, because it's going to get very ugly. What has happened over a period of a decade, after having been trained by the VA hospital to be a veterans advocate, I've learned how to help vets to get the benefits that they deserve.
Yeah.
How to bring their family members, their caretakers in, and we just stay until we get the job done. And I don't give up. Thank you, Air Force Security Forces training. When I was going through and getting my own disability evaluation, one jewel that I'd like to offer your audience for veterans when you're getting your claims certified, go and look and print out what the duties were of your MOS. Mine was blowing stuff up.
Yeah.
And taking care, eradicating a risk. So when you take a veteran in as a volunteer veterans advocate and you say to the VA, you know what? I know you want to do the right thing. The people in the VA hospitals, Paul, you just gave me a great example of that. They're overworked. They're soldiers themselves.
Yep.
My advice to the vets is take your caregiver in. Sit there, don't give up. Just sit there and say, I know you want to do your job. This is what we all fought for, the same reason. And so that's what I do. And I get far more out of it. I know when I'm interviewed, some of the biggest questions are, why would I have all this education and volunteer? Well, as an elderly person, I know that we're all, if we're lucky, going to end up where we can look back and say, did I make a difference?
Yeah.
I make a difference. Because again, working in hospice, I can tell you, Paul, that holding the hands of mostly my brothers, but a couple of my sisters, not one single one of them said, well, I wish I had earned another degree or more money.
Yeah.
all wonder, did they take care of their families and did they make a difference?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think you and I are doing, we're doing amazingly well considering our diagnosis. Post-traumatic stress is something that you manage. I am so grateful to my doctor. I don't know about you, Paul, but my therapist, Dr. Robert Pelk, is a forensic psychologist that was drafted and served during Vietnam himself. So if you're like me and a lot of the veterans I know, trust is very important to us. Establishing that trust to go and get help. Our post-traumatic stress is never cured.
Mm-hmm.
You manage the symptoms.
Yeah.
It's ingrained in us. It's something that you not only live with, you learn to manage and make sure that we're functioning to help others, right? What other blessing is there?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I talked to my wife about it too, and that's one of the reasons why when Cece contacted me several years ago about doing this show, I kind of jumped at the chance, and I was discussing it with my wife, and I said, here's a chance for me to get on, talk with my fellow veterans. Let's let them get on there and share their experiences and get the word out about, their experiences, their lives, things that they've dealt with. Let's help each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I told her, I said, now that I've been doing this for a little while, I told her, I said, yeah, it's not that you look for a pat on the back, but you just feel good feeling like you're being able to do something to give something back. So that's a very good point that you make. But I know that you're pretty heavily involved with the VA hospital, but you're pretty busy as well with the Jefferson County Veterans Organization there where you live too, aren't you?
Well, I've been blessed. VETI, which is a Jefferson County Veterans Organization, kind of got me involved in a political arena that I was kind of glad to get away from when I came to Colorado. But especially thanks to Carl Ham, who's himself a Purple Heart, Vietnam, we lobbied for Lisa Smith to be elected here in Colorado, and we went door to door. And Paul, I actually found that I like it. Lisa Smith herself is a former Air Force security force young lady, a combat cop. I would be so proud to have her as a daughter, and we helped get her elected. One thing I've learned about at this stage in life is I've met some remarkable people. In terms of veterans issues, I like to advocate for the person, not the party.
Yeah.
Because what I've learned now in Colorado at the Capitol is both sides of the political party, they really want to help vets. We need to learn to speak up for ourselves, to do what you're doing, Paul, to be an example, right? Because we're either part of the problem or part of the solution.
Yeah.
And so many of, when I was just on Capitol Hill last week, so many of the legislators are saying, Tina, we want to do something. How do we get the vets to know how to get to the resources so that we have this sense of community that you're doing, that DAV, the Disabled American Veterans groups are doing. How do we reach out and find hope in being part of the mission?
Yeah, it's I'm kind of the same way. I sometimes I see our politicians and you get really frustrated because there's so many things they could be doing. and especially veteran wise. And I mean, I was happy to see, some of the small recent changes that came out, and one of them that just came out not too long ago was that now myself as a disabled veteran, my wife has an opportunity to, when I'm gone, actually go to the VA and find out if she's qualified for a portion of my disability pension.
Thank
And
you for
before,
mentioning it, Paul. That is key. And to get the wives to
yeah,
go in before you're disabled
yeah,
to
I
be
told her when this came out, I told her, I said, when you contact the VA once I'm gone, and I use these terms because my wife's 10 years younger than I am, so I'm pretty sure with all the things I've been through and my age, I'll be gone
sure.
before her. But I told her, I said, when I'm gone, when you report my death, you need to talk to the VA advocate that you talk with and ask them to help you determine if you're eligible under that new law for a portion of my disability pension. And so there are at least some things that are coming out that are, they're trying to make things better. But you're right, there's so many more things they could concentrate on. And I think if they listened more to some of the veterans, they could probably find some good focus areas, to do that. I really do.
Well, and I especially think that we need, Paul, veterans, the older veterans like you and I, we need to be more outspoken
Yeah.
about these and reach out, especially through the DAV. They have sites now where you can your spouse can be registered. The DAV will send out notices to the legislators.
Mhm.
They're willing to listen on both sides because, Paul, let's face it, every right ever earned in America was earned on the backs of the veteran. You walk into a VA hospital, as you talked about, that is what we are relying on as a country to go forward.
Yeah.
It's not the politicians. The politicians serve because the veterans and their families have given so much.
Yeah.
And we're still doing it. What better honor to this country than can you continue for the politicians to listen to the veterans? And we need to be more outspoken. Let's not get angry. I had to get over that myself. Let's not get angry. Let's channel that anger. Let's channel it in support of a vet. And when that vet passes, let's continue that with the family because our families are serving beside us, Paul. What you said about your wife, I can say about my children. I can say about my church. My church is there as a community, my Bible sisters. I mean, we have that. We have each other. We have each other.
Tina, I got to tell you, it has really been good talking with you, and you have such a positive outlook, and it's really, and it's not. I know you're not here to toot your horn, but I got to tell you, I mean, it's really admirable the work that you've undertaken. So I want to ask you one more thing before we wrap the show up. If you had one final thought for our veterans in the audience or just our audience in general that you'd like to share, what would it be?
Well, it would be that I am so incredibly grateful that at this stage in my life, I can just be very thankful for what we have. And I'm very grateful for the community that we're helping to build. As I said earlier, as veterans, we know what we're willing to die for. Now we need to remember what we're going to live for. We are going to live for each other.
Well, I got to tell you, I've never heard it put that way before, but that is a really, really excellent thought about, you know, knowing what you want to live for at this point. So that's a really good thought. Well, Tina, I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to join us tonight. It's been wonderful talking with you, and I really appreciate the work that you're continuing to do to support the veterans out there. And I'm sure your community does as well. So thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
You're welcome. You are so welcome. I'd like to thank your sponsors and all the veterans and their families for having us. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our audience out there tonight. You've been listening to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And there's our mailing address for the Jefferson County Veterans Initiative. So if you want to reach out to them, the address is at the bottom of the screen in Golden, Colorado. And I'm sure they'd be glad to hear from you. You know, whether it's you can volunteer a donation or whatever you want to do. So please contact them and let them know that you want to help. And for our audience out there, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. And those veterans out there in our audience, we want to again thank you for your service and what you're continuing to do. So thank you, and we will see you on our next show.